All right, and as soon as that starts, there it goes. All right, hello everybody. This is Champlain College United Nations Association's first Sustainable Development Goal panel on quality education. Very hopefully the first of many to come. As you can see, we have our panel of experts here who will be giving their presentations in just a moment. I'm going to go ahead and give them a quick introduction, and then we can go in any particular order. I don't really mind how you guys want to do that.
How about
Unless it
How about alphabetical?
alphabetical works.
I haven't even looked how that works, but I think that would, yeah, that would put you last, Professor Hartwell.
Yeah, looks like it.
Uh,
All right. Unless anyone has any beginning questions. That's a very cute dog.
Whenever I'm on Google or chat, he has to be a part of it.
That's a very good rule to have.
Yeah.
Alrighty. If there are no questions, I'll go ahead and start on some intros for our experts, and then we can go ahead and get the show on the road. All right. So if we're going alphabetical, now I have to look at mine because I didn't put it in alphabetical order.
Actually, it's a close call.
It is. I believe Professor Blaisdell. Is that how you pronounce that, Professor?
Oh, I pronounce Blaisdell. Professor Blaisdell.
All right. Well, Professor Blaisdell is first. Professor Nicholas Blaisdell is an adjunct professor in the College of Education at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. As an undergraduate at UMass Amherst, he founded the Peabody Volunteer Tutoring Organization, a community-based organization that provides free summer tutoring for hundreds of students. And Professor Blaisdell is currently teaching a humanities course, which he designed while working in Revere Public School, with a special focus within education in teaching social activism via critical literacy. Outside of teaching, Professor Blaisdell has spoken at several academic conferences, such as the Massachusetts Association of Teachers of Speakers of Other Languages, the National Council of Teachers of English, and the International Systemic Functional Congress. And I believe Professor Blumenfeld is second, and please correct me if I mispronounce your name. You are a former associate professor for the School of Education at Iowa State University and a current lecturer at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Professor Blumenfeld has focused his research and education on social justice, religious oppression, and LGBTQI issues within education. He has authored over 50 papers and written several books, including The What, The So What, and The Now What of Social Justice Education, and Homophobia, How We All Pay the Price. He has contributed several articles to the Huffington Post that cover a wide range of social justice and LGBTQI issues. And then, because I can alphabetize, I believe Hargreaves is next. Dr. Andrew Hargreaves is a professor emeritus of the Lynch School of Education and Human Development at Boston College. During his time there, he was also the Thomas Moore Brennan Chair in Education until 2018, whose mission is to promote social justice and to connect theory and practice in education. Dr. Hargreaves is an internationally recognized advocate for high-quality public education, with several speaking engagements and workshops scheduled for this year that, while most of them have to be canceled due to the current circumstances. He has written or edited over 25 books, one of which, Teaching in the Knowledge Society, Education in the Age of Insecurity, received the Choice Outstanding Book Award from the American Libraries Association for Teaching. And unless you guys have anything you want to add about yourselves, I think we can begin.
And we have a fourth person on here, don't we?
Did I skip somebody? Oh my goodness, Hartwell, I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
So focused on it. All right. Last and certainly not least, Professor Ash Hartwell is an adjunct professor in the College of Education at University of Massachusetts Amherst. He also works at the UMass Center for International Education. His focus is in education in crisis and conflict areas, as well as alternative education. Before coming to the Center of International Education, Professor Hartwell worked in schools, classrooms, and communities in Africa over 25 years. and has served as an education advisor for USAID's Africa Bureau, as well as to UNICEF, CARE, and the World Bank. Professor Hartwell is currently the principal investigator and the M&E specialist for the CIE UMass 5-year project, which aims to build evidence and capacity to increase equitable enrollments in crisis and conflict-affected areas. And now I think we're ready. Sorry about that.
Should I begin my presentation, or are we going to? I had planned for a presentation, right? We're not doing a pan. I wasn't sure if we were doing a circle or a presentation style.
Presentation style, and then afterwards followed by a Q&A to whomever a question is directed at, or if it's directed at the panel as a whole.
All right, great. If we're doing it alphabetically, I guess I should start. I guess. All right, so I guess I'll start. Can I do presentation mode even though I'm not the host?
Oh yeah, you should be able to. There should be, if you mouse over, an option that says present now.
All right, I'll give it a shot. All right, can you all see my screen?
Mm-hmm.
All right, great. Let me just test it real quick. All right. Awesome. So my presentation today is titled Achievement, Access, and Income, Addressing Educational Disparities Through Summer Tutoring. Before I begin my actual presentation for what I did in this to address educational inequality and income inequality in my city, I first want to give some background information on the current state of education in the United States today and inequality. Today, schools with 90% or more students of color spend about $733 less per student per year than schools with 90% or more white students. Today, a higher percent of the students attend segregated schools than in 1968. Up to 80% of any given test score today can be attributed to external factors outside of schooling, including food insecurity, housing insecurity, access to healthcare, livable wages, and more. This is some demographic data from Massachusetts in terms of school dropout rates. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not Massachusetts. This is actually the United States. This is dropout rates by race. As you notice, students of color in the United States are far more likely to drop out of school due to systemic issues that I mentioned earlier. Students of color, particularly black students, are far more likely to receive out-of-school suspensions and are the primary target of school discipline. Students living in poverty, you'll see that black and Hispanic students are far more likely to live in poverty than white students. Right, and these are some of the factors that our students bring into the classroom every day. There's an income inequality in the United States. At the moment, the richest 1% control 32.5% of the wealth, as opposed to only 11.8% of the wealth in the year 2000, 20 years ago. 43% of children under 18 live in low-income families. 1 in 9 American workers have a job that pays poverty-level wages. 1 in 7 households with children were affected by food insecurity in 2018. And to paint a better picture of the intersection between race and class in the United States and how this might interfere with education, this is a distribution of wealth in the city of Boston, right? I'm from Massachusetts. In Boston, the net worth of an average white family totals around $247,500. In the same city, the average net worth of a black family living in Boston is $8. Right? We look at the intersection between race, class, inequality, right? And how this might interfere in our students' education. Oh, I think I'm hearing some music.
Sorry, that's on mine.
Okay, sorry about that. All right. So if we think about inequality in the United States, right? Race, class, and education share in a lot of different ways. And these definitely impact each other in a lot. So one way to think about this, right, is to think about how racial discrimination fuels schooling, right? We're talking about the school to prison pipeline, hyper-policing, the inequalities we saw in school discipline, the inequalities we saw with inequality, economic inequality, and all the factors that talked about in terms of a test, any given test score, right? This presentation has not yet mentioned, but it's really relevant in schools. Think about gender discrimination in terms of sexual assault, homophobia, transphobia, and more. These are some prevalent examples. We think about discrimination based on ethnicity, cultural background, citizenship status. We think about religious discrimination, particularly among Muslim and Jewish folks. Linguistic discrimination in Massachusetts. We had an English-only mandate not that long ago, but luckily it was overturned. We have inadequate accommodations of folks with disabilities in a lot of schools due to underfunding. Which leads to the next point. We think of defunding of public schools via charter schools, budget cuts, and more. Right, and these are just some of the surfaces. This is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of inequality in America's education system. So now flashback to 2016, before I was a professor at UMass Amherst, and when I was only actually an undergrad at UMass Amherst. Right, you're thinking about, a lot of us probably thinking about as undergrads, well, what can we do about this, right? These are really large topics. These are inequalities that have been basically present since the beginning of the United States, right, and before. So it's hard to think about, like, what do we do about this? So another way of thinking about this that helped me process, like, why do these inequalities exist and what do we do about it, is the concept of accumulation by dispossession. This idea was introduced by a Marxist scholar named David Harvey. He builds on Marx's general formula of capital accumulation. Although Marx argues that profit is unpaid labor, Harvey expands on that notion to include other types of power inequalities, wealth inequalities, and resource inequalities. In terms of education, we can think of accumulation by dispossession as this: the dispossession of marginalized students of educational, political, economic, and other opportunities translates directly into the accumulation of opportunities and later wealth, status, and power for more privileged students. The dispossession of public schools and other public schooling opportunities by privatization, funding, inequality of access translates to the accumulation of wealth for private schools, charter schools, and private companies. So now thinking about, like, this framework, we can realize that the reason for these inequalities, right, is that there are folks benefiting from this system, right? It's not neutral. These inequalities don't just exist to exist for themselves. Someone is benefiting from this, right? And if you think about the wealth inequality, it's certainly not the vast majority of folks. So now thinking back as undergrads, as we all probably are, or graduate students, depending on where we're at, right? We want to think about, what can we do about it? What is there to be done? So this brings me back to something you mentioned when you introduced me, was how I created the PBD Volunteer Tutoring Organization. So in the summer of 2016, I created a volunteer tutoring organization that provided free summer tutoring for hundreds of students across the city of Peabody. We did this by simply just getting a group of students together, a group of college students, or my colleagues and friends, and we just emailed our local library. Something that simple. We said, we have an idea, we have a plan. We want to provide free quality academic enrichment for all students in our area, free of cost. As long as you provide us the funding, you provide us this, not the funding necessarily, as long as you provide us the space, we'll be there. As long as we can do that, right, we'll run everything else. You don't need to worry about that. And that's what we did. By summer 2019, we've served over more than 400 students. We enlisted over 80 volunteer tutors. We raised over 80 pounds for food for people struggling with food insecurity in our community. We taught subjects such as English, math, history, science, and more, and SAT preparation, MCAS prep. We taught everything in between. And the goal of this was, right, thinking back to disrupting that system of accumulation by dispossession, where wealthier students of more privileged backgrounds, are afforded opportunities such as summer tutoring, academic enrichment, and stuff like that. And that helps fuel the inequality that we're seeing in the economy, inequality we're seeing in education, inequalities that have persisted for centuries now, right? And this is something that anyone can really do. It just really takes some dedication and organization. And I can talk about more of that during the question and answer about how to do something like this. So this brings me to one of my last slides, thinking about moving forward in the age of Black Lives Matter and COVID-19. Right, I have an agenda here for social change folks can think about. Right, we could be designing anti-racist, anti-capitalist curriculum in classrooms. We could be thinking about creating free alternative education opportunities for marginalized students, right? Something that got me started in the field of education even as an undergrad. We could be working to dismantle inequitable structures and systems in schools, right? Thinking about policy changes. I'm also a teacher at Revere Public Schools during the day, professor by night. So some of the things I could do is work towards creating or dismantling inequitable systems in our school system, whether it's a new policy that disproportionately targets students without internet, especially in the age of COVID, unfair grading policies, assumptions about where students go after school, and creating new structures like in the previous bullet point. Additionally, we should be working to dismantle inequitable systems and structures outside of schools, right? And that can be something like attending protests, working toward social change in terms of the economy, education, race relations, etc. So here are some of the references. I can share these afterwards for some of the tables and stuff that I mentioned. But
Thank you. That was really great. I think
Okay.
we'll hold questions until the very end for that, so we can move on to Professor Blumenfeld. I believe you're next.
Okay, I'm trying to share my screen. I'm not seeing how to do that. It said I need to have permission to do that. Present now, I'm pushing. And it
Okay.
says your entire screen or a window. What do I?
If you want to just share your presentation screen, then a window should work.
You must grant permission in order to share screen. Nicholas, how did you do it?
I clicked the present now button,
Yeah.
and then I shared a Chrome tab. I had a Google Chrome tab. I just shared my presentation through there.
I only have two options, your entire screen or a window.
And neither of them work?
It said I need permission.
It's not telling me somebody's asking, which I would assume it would do. Let me see if I can't give you permission somehow.
I could look at my PowerPoint, but you won't be able to see it.
Or Warren, you could just do it old school. You know, you could just do it old school without slides. A slide-free, safety net-free presentation.
I organize through my slides though, so that is my old school.
Aziz says if you pick window, you should be able to open your presentation in whatever program that is in.
Okay, I put a window and then it says, can't share your screen. You must grant permission in order to share screen. Asking for your permission to use it. I don't know how I grant permission.
Oh, it's asking for your permission. Do you see any little pop-up at the top of your screen that says, allow? Oh, it said you're most likely asking for your permission to use PowerPoint. Do you see that?
On the top of my screen?
There might be a little pop-up that says such and such would like to have access to this program. Do you see anything like that?
Okay, let's see now. It won't let me do it. I'll look at my PowerPoint and then I can send it to you if anyone would like my PowerPoint.
If you send it to me and then tell me when you want to flip pages, I can pull it up for you there.
Why don't we go with somebody else? I'll send it to you now as someone else is presenting. Okay?
Okay, we can come back to you. I believe that puts Hargreaves as next. You're muted.
Yeah. The delicious thing about my section of the presentation is that it is absolutely without any slides whatsoever. So You will have to look at my scary face for the next 10 to 15 minutes, and hopefully that will not be a distraction, but prove the opposite. This session, I believe, is about Sustainable Development Goal number 4, which is about quality education. And if I was in a room with you all now, I'd then ask you a question. I'd ask you to turn to your partner and define sustainability. What do we mean by sustainability? Um, so think about that for a second. What do we mean by it's a term we use a lot. What do we mean by it? Well, some people, when they talk about sustaining things, they mean keeping things going. They mean endurance. They mean persistence. In leadership, we might think about leadership succession, for example. It's not all about you. It's about the people after you. Another meaning of sustain is, of course, to nourish, to feed ourselves. So there's something here not just about endurance, but also about quality. And then I'd probably ask you who first invented the term of sustainability. People would feel uncomfortable for a few minutes. Some would look it up on Google, probably most would. And then the fastest on Google would come up with Lester Brown at the World Watch Institute in 1980. And then the Brundtland Commission of 1987. And the Brundtland Commission, which led to everything that led up to the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, said this, that sustainable development means that humankind has the ability to achieve sustainable development, to meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So sustainability has started to get us to think not only about what's good for us, but to think of ourselves relationally. How does what we do affect people in the future? And how does what we do affect people around us? This is desperately important if you're a private school, for example. Everything you do, everything you want, everything you believe, how does that impact on the public school sector, on people who have a little less, whereas many students in your school will have a little more. So I just wanted you to think first about, I'm not making this up, I wrote a book in 2016 called Sustainable Leadership, where we outlined 7 principles that are basically environmentally based. And if you want to know them, they are quickly, but you can read the book. They are depth. You can't sustain things that are meaningless or valueless. They have to have value. They are length, endurance, beyond yourself, over time. They are spread in terms of distributed, shared leadership, how that affects other people. They are social justice in terms of your impact on others around you. They are about energy renewal, not energy depletion. They are about diversity rather than standardization. Diverse eco environments are much more sustainable than highly standardized eco or organizational environments. And they're about conservation, preserving the best of the past, not all of the past, but not rejecting the past, in order to move forward into the future. So just a few things about sustainability. What is quality education within the context of this? What is it that we need from quality learning and quality teaching? This morning, in my slightly strange online life that I had now, I did an interview with the BBC Radio 4 in the UK. It's an obituary program called Last Words. It's not about me. I'm not dead yet. But it was about somebody probably many of you know called Sir Ken Robinson. And Sir Ken Robinson made the first well-known TED Talk called Who Killed Creativity? And his TED Talks have attracted 66 million views. It is the TED Talk of all TED Talks about the importance of creativity in learning. And I know Ken quite well. He's from the north of England, like me. So they asked me to contribute to this program, which will come up on Friday. And one story I told in that video was that just about a year ago, many of you will remember, there was a terrible shooting in Christchurch, New Zealand, in two mosques. Scores of people, worshippers, family, friends, were slaughtered, basically. And last year, I arrived just days after that in Christchurch to do a leadership workshop all day with school principals who were anguished. I was surprised they even came. I had no idea what to do. What could I say to comfort them, to distract them, to uplift them? So I thought I'll take the most famous person I know in the world that they will know and respect and have them send a message. So Ken sent a message, and it was empathetic and it was supportive. All the things about leaders we want that in America we're not fully quite getting right now from our president. And in this message, though, there was substance. And the way he began was, he said, nobody is born to hate. Nobody is born to hate. People learn how to hate. So what's our job as teachers and as schools? That is to teach people to learn how to love. And he didn't only mean love in the spiritual sense or the emotional sense. He also meant to love learning, to be inspired by learning, learning that has meaning and purpose. Before coronavirus, surveys at Stanford University and in the UK show that around 30% of adolescents believe that life has no meaning or purpose for them. Life has no meaning or purpose, 30%. Jean Twenge, in her book iGen, who began a career writing about narcissism and now writes about technology, describes how from 2012, anxiety rates shot up amongst adolescents and particularly adolescent girls. Was this to do with inequity? A bit. Was it to do with other things? A bit. What was the main reason? Technology. iPhones, the tool of the devil, the tyranny of the iPhone, where adolescent girls were feeling safer physically, less likely to be physically abused, less likely to experience early pregnancy, less likely to engage with alcohol or drug abuse, less likely to experience violence, but more likely to be anxious because they're alone on their beds, far into the night, not going to sleep, looking at what other people think of them. And another survey that just came out this week shows that about a third of adolescent girls digitally enhance their profiles and their images on media because who they are is not enough for the people they know. So we have a massive problem in this world now with adolescents, with people like you and all the others that Nicholas described, people in poverty, even more, with not just literacy and mathematics and science, but also with well-being. And we know that actually these things are related. So Wilkinson and Pickett, who wrote a book called The Spirit Level in 2009, examined where are the societies where well-being is the worst, and what is the greatest predictor of ill-being. And the major factor which links with Nicholas's presentation was inequality of income and of wealth. The more unequal you are as a country or as a state, so they also compared state by states, the worse your well-being will be. Anything, criminality, severity of incarceration, educational achievement, early pregnancy, alcohol abuse, opioid addiction, obesity, just go on, depression, anxiety, just go on and all through these. So the greatest predictor is inequity. And there's another alongside this, which is that the schools cause this as well. And so the OECD have produced data that show how quality of life compares to educational achievement on test scores. And there are four, we all love this as professors, there are four quadrants. And there's the high well-being, high achievement, low well-being, low achievement. The most interesting one is low well-being, high achievement. And which of those countries? They're the most tested countries in the world. The most testing, the more examinations, the more obsessed you are in education with just driving up achievement at any price, the worse your well-being will be, because you've no time for your relationships. You've no time to play outside. Ken Robinson says that young people in America, children, have less time to play outside per day than prisoners in the Shawshank Redemption, because they're so busy focusing on the cognitive material that they have to learn and remember. And then they're hovered over by their parents. In America, we call them helicopter parents. In Singapore, they call children the strawberry generation. In the Netherlands, they call them curling parents, who are always sweeping obstacles out the way, like they are in curling on the ice, so that the children have a clear path in front of them. So I'd ask you listening now, what can you do about this? When you go to college, what will you study? What kind of career are you looking for? The 30% of you have no meaning or purpose, but you still really want to work for Goldman Sachs and make a killing financially, and that's your biggest ambition? Or are you going to find something that has purpose or value? If I ask you the question, which job will have most prestige for you? Or if I asked you, which job would you like the person you marry to have? And then I took you to Finland, one of the highest performing countries in the world. The answer would be teaching. The answer in Finland would be that teaching is as hard to get into as medicine is, because it has such prestige and value. And if you want to marry somebody in Finland, the most important occupation, if you're marrying a man, I'm sorry, Warren, I think this is not same sex. The Finns haven't quite got there yet. But if a woman is marrying a man, then the number one preferred occupation is to be a doctor still. The doctors still have it. But the number two is to be a teacher. And if you're marrying a woman, the number one occupation is to be a teacher, not because they're kind and caring, but because it's prestigious, intelligent, it's Darwinian, it's about the gene pool for your future children. If you marry a teacher, you're marrying the best that you can get. So how in America and everywhere, because some of your students will be from other countries, do we get the high quality teachers to produce high quality learning and well-being? And in 2012, my Canadian colleague and I, Michael Fullen, wrote a book called Professional Capital. We actually invented the concept of professional capital. We did it by accident, and then we thought lots of people would have written about it, and then we discovered that they hadn't. Professional capital means simply, if you want a return from your teachers, you have to make an investment in them. And there are three kinds of investment. First is human capital. Get people who are highly qualified, pay them well enough, train them properly in a university as a profession, not 6 weeks over the summer like Teach for America. And then second, once you've got the best people, invest in decisional capital, judgment, which means develop the quality of their judgment over the long course of their careers. Not just 3 years like Teach for America, and then let them move on so they can go and work for a law firm or a business or something else. But keep investing over time. The third and most important one is social capital. And the social capital is that teachers are better together than they are alone. Social capital, collaboration, adds value to human capital. And the way I'll finish this is that social capital exists not just within a school amongst the teachers, but it should also exist across schools, including schools of socioeconomic status. So that if you have a little bit more as a school, you share some of what you have with the schools around you that have a little bit less. So the next time you have your SDG Goal 4 presentation with your students, invite some of your students from the local public schools as well as the students from your school. These are very small things we can do, but they all accumulate. They are about social capital. They are about quality teaching and learning, and they're about sustainable development, because it means the privilege you have now to work with us, 4 white men. You should think about that next time too. The privilege you have to work 4 old white men, well, 3 out of 4, 3 out of 4 old white men. The privilege you have with us is a privilege to be shared, to open with other people, so that what you experience to advance your learning does not take place at the cost of less fortunate or less advantaged children around you in the community. So I hope you think that the absence of PowerPoints didn't spoil this, and I look forward to hearing our other panelists now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hargreaves. Dr. Blumenfeld, Professor Blumenfeld, I have your presentation. Do you want to go next, or do you want to go to Hartwell next? It's up to you guys. I can't hear you, Professor Hartwell. You go? Okay. All right, hang on just a second.
Okay.
Let me open that up.
I echo Andrew's discussion that I hope we do see more of a diverse panel when we do discuss educational reform and educational changes. And saying that, I'm also feeling very honored to be amongst this distinguished group of people. And in some ways, it shows where we are at UMass Amherst in the College of Education. It's really nice to be a part of the panel as well. So if we can make it in oh, can I do that? No, I can't. Yeah, full screen. So we don't have this. There's a way of making it full screen. Up on the top. Oh, well. Okay. Okay. So the flow and enable editing. There we go. Okay. So my next book is going to be called The Murphy's Law of Audiovisual Equipment. Anything that can go wrong usually does when I'm giving a presentation. But I like using PowerPoint because of the term equity. Not all people are auditory listeners. I'm a visual learner, and I get a lot from PowerPoints. I'm also an auditory learner, so I'm combining the auditory along with the visual. So if we can go to the next slide. My agenda for today, we call the gay agenda. That's a joke. Diversity versus social justice education. In many ways, I'm going to be picking up where Nicholas and Andrew began and left off as well. So it seems that the first 3 presentations anyway are really coordinated and linked. I'm going to be talking about James A. Banks's levels of curricular inclusion and Sonia Nieto's tapestry. Next slide. So I want to make a distinction between diversity education. I'm not talking about diversity in terms of the people on this panel, but diversity education versus social justice education, or what's called critical multiculturalism. Next. Carl A. Grant and Christine Sleater talk a little bit about the focus on diversity education, which some of the tenets of diversity education are. Next slide. It promotes a feeling of unity, tolerance, and acceptance amongst people. I'm okay, you're okay. My culture's okay, your culture's okay. Focuses on attitudes and feelings students have about themselves and each other, which is very important. The curriculum addresses individual differences and similarities and contributions of the groups in which the students are members. Information about various ethnic, racial, disability, gender, or social class groups about whom the students hold stereotypes. It's a way of reducing stereotypes, initiating tolerance, acceptance, valuing of different cultures. Sometimes this is called the Heroes, Holidays, Foods, and Festivals approach. We're going to have Latinx Day, and we're going to talk about, mariachi bands and eating tacos and enchiladas. We're going to be talking about some of the heroes, some of the holidays, and this is a form of multiculturalism, but it doesn't talk about the largest social inequities. It doesn't bring about discussions about larger societal issues that marginalize some and privilege others. Next. I'm a social justice educator. I've written much about social justice education, and I use social justice as my lens of perception on the world. I take off my glasses in front of my students and said, social justice is not necessarily a course that you may be teaching in the schools. It may not be a course that you're going to be teaching specific on issues of social justice, but it's a lens of perception in which I spend 24/7 of my life looking through these lenses of social justice and how they relate to every aspect of my life, including my teaching. Next. So I've given a definition of social justice. We see a lot of definitions, so I came up with my own. The concept that local, national, and global communities function where everyone has equal access to an equitable distribution of the rights, benefits, privileges, and resources, and where everyone can live freely, unencumbered by social constructions of hierarchical positions of domination and subordination based on social identities and backgrounds. It's just a springboard of what are we talking about when we're talking about social justice. Next. The term has several predecessors. It is used in the preamble of the International Labor Organization, an agency of the United Nations, stating that universal and lasting peace can be established only if it is based on social justice. The United Nations has long ago realized that we cannot have a sustainable, peaceful world without having a foundation in issues around social justice. Next. So some of my assumptions going into social justice education. Issues of power, privilege, and domination within US society center around inequitable social divisions regarding race, ethnicity, socioeconomic class, sex assigned at birth, gender identity, sexual identity, religion, nationality, linguistic background, physical and mental abilities, disabilities, physical appearance, age, and other social factors. We must see, in many ways, oppression as a wheel, with all the individual spokes on that wheel being individual forms of oppression. If we try to take out one spoke, say racism, for example, that wheel will continue to roll and trample over people. The rim keeping this wheel together, I believe, is white supremacy and patriarchy. That is what is the connecting strand, keeping all of these forms of oppression firmly locked in place. Next. Students ask me, well, can African Americans be oppressive? And I give this equation. Oppression constitutes prejudice plus social power, or the mathematical equation O equals P plus SP. Can marginalized group be prejudiced against the dominant group? Of course. But do they have the social power to enact that prejudice on a societal and institutional level to enforce oppression? I maintain no. Do LGBTQ people have the social power to oppress heterosexual people on a societal level? I say no. Do people of color have the social power to enforce prejudice against white people on a societal and institutional level? I argue again, no. Next. Issues around social identities impact life outcomes, general and specific, on educational outcomes. And Nicholas talked very brilliantly about how this is done. Next. And I'm not just saying that because you're from UMass. Social inequities are reproduced in the schools. They do not develop in the schools. Next. Social reproduction theory. Next. Early exponents were Samuel Bowles and Herbert Gintis. Next, who basically made the comment, the theory that schools reproduce the social inequities, especially in terms of socioeconomic class and race, that exist in the larger society. They do not originate within the schools. They mirror, they are reproduced within the schools. And when we do social justice education within the schools, we can reverse reproduce. From the schools, we can reproduce social justice within the larger society. So it's this symbiotic relationship in and out, back and forth. Next. Some of the ways in which oppression is reproduced in the schools are tracking. When we put students in these tracks, college level tracks, basic tracks, other tracking in the secondary schools, we're maintaining the reproduction of the inequalities in the larger society. Ability grouping is basically tracking within the elementary schools. When we put students in different groups within the same classroom, the low functioning, the middle functioning, the higher functioning, students know what group they're in. And they develop a lower sense of self-esteem if they know they're in this lower functioning groups. Teacher expectations. Many studies have been done on when teachers expect students to perform a certain way, that's the way that they're going to perform. If we expect high performance from all of our students, more likely they will function to the level that they're expected to function. Counseling methods of parents and of students also affect the ways in which they function and their outcomes. Unequal funding expenditures. Unfortunately, we have inequitable funding sources within the schools, and Nicholas again talked about the primarily working class and schools where the majority of people of color get less funding per student than the schools in the richer areas where mainly there are more percent of white students. Next. When we look at the percentage of white teachers within the schools, many times it's difficult for a student of color who does not see their mirror image in front of the classroom to develop a sense of identity, a positive sense of identity, and an appreciation for learning when they're spoken to and taught by teachers who do not look like themselves. So even in 2018, 80% of the teachers within the schools of the United States are white, whereas students of color comprise 51% of the students nationwide in our schools. Next. There is a vast difference between equality and equity. We can treat people equal, or we can treat people equitable. Next. And this slide shows the difference between equality and equity. We're treating people equally on the left, but we need to accommodate to people's needs in order for them to function effectively. And not to berate this, but this is why I try to present in a classroom multimodally, using auditory, visual, tactile, kinesthetic, movement activity. I have students move around the classroom. I have them talking and showing visuals at the same time. So we tap into multi-modes of learning. Next. Having a grounding in history is essential in helping to answer some questions regarding how these inequities developed and have been maintained up to the present date. I don't know the difference between students in Britain, students in New Zealand, and students in the United States, but I believe the United States is presenting in a historical context. Slavery ended. We don't have to talk about that anymore. Jim Crow ended. Just get over it. We don't understand the legacy of oppression that affects people every single day of their life. There's this collective Jungian sense of collective identity. I'm Jewish, and we have this expression of post-traumatic Holocaust syndrome. You don't have to have been in Europe during the Holocaust to understand, to have this collective sense of oppression. There's a woman, I think her first name is Joy. There's a book out called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, how the legacy of slavery impacts African-American students to this very day. You don't have to have been enslaved. You don't have to have been alive during Jim Crow era, or even in the 1950s and 1960s. There's this collective sense of trauma, whether you were actually experienced trauma firsthand. We need to teach history, and not only about white men making wars. Next. Social justice approach, awareness of the historical legacies, maintenance of systems of power and oppression. Sometimes for my students, they're invisible. There's no sexism going on anymore. That was during my mother's day when she was a feminist in the 60s. Sometimes the legacies and the maintenance of oppression seems somewhat invisible. Based on intersecting social identities, we're not just of one identity, we're of multiple identities, and we need to look at the ways in which we're privileged as well as subordinated on the individual, interpersonal, institutional, and societal cultural levels. Pervasive cultural inclusion, and in statewide and school-wide culture and climate. Not necessarily a set aside. We're going to have an African-American history course. Or I teach LGBTQ issues in education at UMass. This is great, but all pre-service teachers should be getting instruction on LGBT, people of color, people with disabilities in all of their courses. Education for personal and social action, transformation, and liberation. Education to change the society. Next. Now, James Banks talks about levels of multicultural curricular reform and inclusion. Next. And I'm just going to very quickly go over these. The contributions approach, the lowest level. The additive approach. The transformation approach, and the social action approach. Next. Contributions, that heroes, holidays, little emphasis of the meanings and importance of these cultural elements. The curriculum is not transformed or really changed in any way. Next. Content, concepts, themes, and perspectives are added to the curriculum without changing its structure. We might have a shaded column on the left about women's history in that one page when we're talking about World War II. There might be a shaded column about women in the women's, the WAC. I don't remember what that stands for, but that's like an additive approach. That's not changing the content, really. Next. The disadvantages, it's kind of like what we call ethnic tourism. We're just kind of glimpsing at different cultures as a tourist would in a country other than their own. Next. Transformative approach. This really changes the fulcrum on which education is based from a mainly white, Western, heterosexual European context to multi-fulcrums, African-American fulcrum, Latinx fulcrum, LGBTQ fulcrum, people with disabilities fulcrum. So now the basis of the curriculum has many fulcrums on which it is based. Next. And looking at education to transform the individual and to make decisions to transform the society. Next. So yes, all of this is messy, but another great UMass professor, Sonia Nieto, talks about the messiness of critical multiculturalism or social justice education. A tapestry is a hand-woven textile. When examined from the back, it may simply appear to be a motley group of threads, but when reversed, the threads work together to depict a picture of structure and beauty, a tapestry symbolizing through its knots, broken threads, and seeming jumble of colors and patterns on the back, the tensions, conflicts, and dilemmas that a society needs to work out. The spirit of both collaboration and struggle is evident in the school. And to close, I will say that in order for this to happen, we need to have safety within the classroom to deal with these messy, difficult topics and conversations. And to get back to Andrew's discussion, in the United States, we do not act like Scandinavia. We do not give a lot of acknowledgement and credit and prestige to teachers. When I taught at Colgate University as an assistant visiting professor, I taught in the Educational Studies department, and a irate parent called me on the phone one day yelling at me. I was thinking, what did I do? Did I say something in class that irritated, their son? And the father said to me, look, my son just changed his major from business to educational studies. I need to tell you this right out. I did not send my son to Colgate to be, and he said with disgust, a teacher, as if it is something so low and demeaning. I sent my son to be a business major to work on Wall Street. Now, this in some ways was an indication of the low status, the low pay, the low salary. We don't go into education to earn a great living. Some teachers have 2 or 3 jobs in order to just put bread on the table. We need to raise the status. Yeah, we need to raise the status of educators in our country. Period. The end.
Thank you. That was really great. I believe Professor Hartwell is next. Professor Hartwell, you're muted there. We can't hear you.
Put your cursor on the bottom, and then you will see a microphone, and just press on that microphone to unmute.
There we go. Okay, thanks. I need a little technical help navigating this. I'm noticing that it's 6 o'clock, and I would say that gives me about 2 minutes.
Oh no, we go until about 6:30, and whatever time is left would be question and answer. You have plenty of time.
Okay, I really appreciated Andrew's oral presentation. Very lovely. It's the old school. Andrew, I really appreciated the old school approach. And I wanted to send my regards because I was a colleague and friend of Joe Farrell at OISE, and we did a lot of work together on a variety of things that I'm going to talk about today. Anyway, we've been talking about, when we speak of Goal 4, we really looked at the quality issue, and quality not from the point of view is what are the grades, what's the achievement in terms of the academic learning, but rather the focus on equity, on purpose and meaning in education, and on social justice. And thanks, Warren, for that exposition and the reminder of Sonia Nieto's wonderful work on tapestries and stories. My presentation is a global one. It's not domestic. In fact, it doesn't even touch on domestic, but it deals with the same issues, but from a global perspective. And actually, I want to move pretty quickly so that we can get to the heart of what I view as as an educator, you have to be optimistic, I think. What else can we be? And looking at an alternative way of conceiving of and delivering and realizing education that is equitable, addresses social justice, and focuses on unity and diversity and inclusion. And so that's what I want to focus on. And I'm going to move pretty quickly then, if my slides work at all. And I don't have the same. I did send you, Kelsey, my presentation. I first sent you the wrong one, and then I sent you the right one. And if it doesn't work for me to get on, then I'm going to ask you to do it. Okay.
All right, go ahead and give it a try, and I'll pull it up just in case on mine.
Okay, I'm clicking, and captions, I'm not getting any. Wait, let me try again. Let's go. Shall I do a window? Okay. And share. I think we're going to do it. It says I can't share it. You have to use permission. I have the same problem Warren does. So Kelsey, I'm going to ask you to do it, and I'm going to need to do it in the slideshow presentation because it's got a couple of videos in it that require the slideshow.
Just to be sure
And
I
if
have it
it
right,
doesn't
it's
work, I'll
the
just go oral. That's okay too.
UN Association
That's it.
PowerPoint. Looks like you need to give me permission to view it. So you should have gotten an email in your Google account that's saying I requested access.
All right, I'll look for that. I don't I don't see anything in my inbox.
Hang on. Go ahead and hit refresh and I'll send it again.
All right. There we go. Do I say open sharing settings?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Okay. Right. Do you guys see this on the screen?
No, but I've gotten access, so I can open that up.
Okay. I'm kind of, I use a lot of different platforms, but I haven't used the Google one. So,
I'm sorry, but I'm glad it's not just me.
oh yeah. You know, we have a lot to learn and we all feel a little bit challenged. So, Kelsey, are you able to show that as a slideshow?
Yep, I think if I open it up in Google Docs, it should let me present. There we go. Now if it'll load, there we are. Can
Is that
everybody
it?
see that?
Okay. So this is it's an overview of the global education response to the fact that there's actually increasing numbers of refugees, kids who are displaced, internally displaced, and victimized in the world today, and we're going to particularly look at the role of programs called accelerated education, which attempt to address those issues by actually also looking at innovative ways to provide a really quality experience of learning that links to purpose in one's local environment and the core competencies. So move to the next one. Next slide. Hello?
Yep, I'm still here. Are you seeing it move?
No, maybe I'm on the
Oh,
wrong.
wait.
There we go. Okay, you can move to the next one. So I want to ask you guys, why do you think this goal is important? And we can't have a dialogue, but I want you to think about that for a moment. Just so why is education important? And there's the usual answers to this. Okay, that it contributes to a country's well-being, that it provides opportunity, and so forth. But go to the next, click to the next one. It does enable upward mobility and it helps to escape poverty. The fact is that over the last 5 years or so, a little longer, the number of kids being able to get into schooling has actually stagnated worldwide. Next slide, next click. And there are over 260 million kids who are out of school just before the pandemic hit. It's a little more than that, actually. And of those, at least half of the kids worldwide are not meeting minimum proficiency standards in reading and math. We're not learning how to read. Go to the next. One of the reasons Goal 4 is so important is that it actually contributes synergistically with a lot of the other goals. For example, with health, we know that providing a basic education really contributes to health and well-being, particularly for girls, but generally, and that there's an interactive effect because you have to have pretty good health to be able to be a good learner. So there's an interaction effect. But to the extent that basic education can be provided, it really improves health. It also obviously improves economic opportunity and general well-being. Go on. But as mentioned, there are over 260 kids who are out of school. About 120 million of those are out of primary and lower secondary. And there hasn't been much progress in changing these numbers. Going on to the next. I'm moving through these slides pretty quickly because I think they're just the background to what I want to really talk about. But schooling doesn't equal learning. And the fact is, as I said before, that there are hundreds of millions of kids around the world who are unable to read, write, or do basic math. And the evidence is you can go to school but not get those skills. And that's particularly true in the world's most vulnerable populations and what we call fragile countries. Next click. In sub-Saharan Africa, almost 88% of the kids who reach the end of primary education are not learning how to read. Well, the kids who are both get through the end of schooling and those who don't, but it's a very high percentage. And without being able to read, you're not really able to do much else in the way of education. So it's a really fundamental skill, competency. Going on. And there's, just as in this country, there's a strong link between poverty and education. This is a mapping of the countries which have extreme poverty, below $1 a day. Although that term doesn't mean very much because a lot of the economies in the poorest countries are based on exchange rather than monetary values. But you can see they're centered in sub-Saharan Africa and also in India. And going to the next one, conflict is also very highly linked to equity, as Warren and Nicholas really point out that inequity leads to social senses. It doesn't contribute to well-being, and there's a strong relationship also between inequity, poverty, and conflict. And this map changes every year because the conflicts shift around. But it shows those areas where there's the greatest level of conflict. Next. And here's the distribution just before COVID-19 of education access and quality mapped globally. It's the mapping of SDG 4. And you can see that the largest concentration of kids who are not able to get quality education is in sub-Saharan Africa, and also Afghanistan, some in Pakistan, some areas of Pakistan, and Myanmar. And I'm not quite sure why Mexico is here. That's a puzzle to me. I think that's a mistake. These people make mistakes. Going next. The fact is that violent conflict in the world is actually not getting better. It actually is increasing somewhat. Although large-scale wars are no longer taking place, there is a lot of local violent conflict internally to countries, and it has been increasing. And that has led to increased numbers of refugees, both internally and across country lines. We know, of course, of the Syrian refugees that have flooded into Turkey and Lebanon and Jordan and on to Greece. But there's also millions of refugees internally in Africa, South Sudan, Somalia, and so forth. So next. And it's not just a matter of numbers. It's really the experience kids have when when they when they witness conflict or the threat of conflict, what they see and what they feel, what they think about that. And here, two girls walking to school in the face of armed carriers, conflict, and that causes a certain level of anxiety and trauma, and it makes it very difficult for them to concentrate, obviously, on what might be happening in the classroom. Next. Before COVID-19, as I mentioned, that inclusion and equitable quality education was really too slow, and the projections based on what was happening is that over 200 million kids would still be out of school in 2030 when the goal is supposed to be met. So we weren't on the trajectory of getting them there. But the inequalities exacerbated by COVID have been enormous. In fact, there's now an estimated 1.4 billion kids who are out of school worldwide, and that's going to affect the poorest in the world far more than those who are well off. Next. So enough of the bad news. I want to talk about ways that we can think globally about an initiative to address the challenge. And it comes out of a group that I've been involved in over the last 6 years called the Accelerated Education Working Group. And it's made up of a number of agencies that are working, a lot of them right on the front lines of countries like Southern Sudan and Somalia and DRC and Afghanistan, the tribal areas of Pakistan, Mindanao and the Philippines and others. In trying to find ways of reaching kids in these contexts with a quality education. And we call it a Accelerated Education Working Group. And part of the reason for that, I'll explain in a moment why it's called Accelerated Education. Next. This approach called accelerated education kind of fits between non-formal education and formal education, because on one hand, it takes from non-formal education a pedagogy, which is really about inclusion. It's learner-centered and active-based. It's got a condensed time frame, so kids who are over age and out of school can come in and complete the equivalent of, say, 3 grades in 1 year. Complete the equivalent of 6 grades in 2 or possibly 3 years, and do it by having a much more effective curriculum and pedagogy. And yet at the same time, it has a recognized certificate so that when kids finish the accelerated education program, they can transfer into the formal schools. And there's always the question of, well, are they able to succeed in the formal schools? And I'll come to that in a moment. To the next. So who are the accelerated education learners in these programs? And there are, by the way, hundreds and hundreds of programs now in the countries that are the poorest and the most needy. They're overage, related to the ordinary age of primary school kids. Many of them are mothers. Some are kids who are working, but who are able to take some time off for learning. And they almost inevitably have come from being out of school because they dropped out and couldn't continue, or had never been to school in the first place. So it's reaching the most marginalized and the most needy. Next. And in the better programs, and not necessarily all of them, teaching is got this term learner-centered, which is a very vague term in a way. It's used very loosely, but essentially learner-centered teaching is and pedagogy is working to address kids' physical, social, and emotional needs. In other words, it starts with what the kids come to the program with, not what the curriculum says they should do. It creates opportunities for experiential learning, which means that they get actively engaged in what they're learning through community work, through service, through interaction with each other. It's highly relevant to the student's own background and experience, and it's age appropriate. In other words, it treats kids not just as little unlearned, but as people who are coming to the program with life experiences that are valuable, even if they may be traumatic and difficult, but they're real life experiences that they can draw from in their learning. Next. The other difference is that instead of doing what I'm doing now, talking to you from the teacher to the group, it's highly interactive, where students collaborate with each other in groups, with dyads, with small groups, with tasks that they have as groups, and they're expected to help each other. So that's another meaning of student-centered learning, is that the teacher isn't the font of all knowledge, but the kids learn from each other. And those who are able to master a particular competency become helpers to those who are struggling. Next. This is just a couple of pictures of two classrooms. One is in a new settlement in Uganda, where there are hundreds and thousands of refugees coming from South Sudan, more than half of whom are children, and youth who are looking for schooling because they can't get it in Southern Sudan. And another is something called speed schools in Uganda, also with the refugees, but it's also in Ethiopia. And I'm going to, or maybe you have to, you'll have to do this by clicking on the Ethiopia underline. It's got a link to a short video. Okay, move down and click on the, and it's a,
Medhanit Ayo is 14 years old. Until recently, she was one of Ethiopia's 2 million children under the age of 14 who have never been to school. Thanks to the creative approach of the Speed School program, she's about to catch up with her peers in less than a year.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Previously, I couldn't write or read my name. Now I can write and read anything. Previously, I could only count money in low numbers. Now I know basic maths very well.
Good morning, good morning.
At the Speed School, children are taught the basics of primary education through an accelerated learning system, a fun and activity-based system that uses games, music, and flashcards. Through these activities, the children are taught reading, writing, and math skills in just 10 months. At the end of the course, they sit a final exam that qualifies them to join the regular primary school at 4th grade.
The children are amazing. Because they're eager to learn, and because they're a bit more mature, they can pick things up very quickly. Many of the students who previously attended speed school are now in grades 5, 6 or grade 7 in the regular government schools.
Even though primary and secondary education is free in Ethiopia, it costs around $10 a year for stationery and a school uniform. When parents find it difficult to pay, they often decide not to send their child to school. Medhanit's mother knows how it feels to be uneducated.
I am an illiterate person. I can't read or write. I can't even write my name. I wouldn't want to see my child become like me. I want her to change herself through education, and I hope she will do well in her studies. I don't want her to become like me.
Since its establishment in 2011, the Speed School project has integrated about 70,000 out-of-school children into the regular education system in 3 regional states of Ethiopia. But once these students are back at school, how can we guarantee that they won't drop out if their parents again can't afford to pay for their materials?
In order to address this problem, our organization helped mothers to establish their own saving and credit association, and it provides seed money. So this enables mothers to start their own small business and support their children to continue his or her education in the coming academic year.
Okay. So next slide. The Accelerated Education Program has developed 10 principles around how to organize and run accelerated education programs. And there's been a good deal of research over the last 3 or 4 years, and it increases to look at the application of these principles and see how they really make a difference. But we're getting more enthusiastic about the possibility that accelerated education, because it's outside the box and really looking at the interaction and relationships in a very different way, where we really honor the capacity of every child to be a learner, and don't the effort of competition and standardized tests isn't there, but the milestones towards competencies is, and we're finding more and more enthusiasm about this by countries. So we feel that, move to the next slide, that it is a strategy for catching up on lost learning by applying accelerated approaches in response to the fact that so many kids have missed a year of schooling or will do because of COVID-19. I'm going to stop there because the time is pretty much up. But I wanted to thank you, and to say, our optimism about what can be done by looking at, even in the most difficult circumstances, looking at ways of organizing learning that are outside the box and that honor every kid's potential for being a learner, and look at issues of equity and justice and reaching the underserved. That's what this is about. And the fact is, we are learning how to do this pretty well. We just need now really system response and take up on a larger scale. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hartwell. That was really great. And yes, he's right. We are almost out of time, but and I don't want to take up too much of your day, but I think we might have time for a couple of questions if anyone has anything pressing in the audience.
A little overwhelming.
Well, I have questions if no one else has questions. Oh, Absa has some. I'll let her go first. Go ahead, Absa, if you want to type them out. Oh, you'll wait? Okay. All right. Well, I have a couple of questions. They're a little bit broad, but I think they fit well in what we've been talking about so far. I guess I will start with my question for Blaisdell. I was wondering if you could expound a little bit more about how your work with teaching in I believe it's the Reeves School, and secondary teaching, and how you think that's impacted your opinion on quality education, seeing it in person, at least in our country.
Definitely. So my experience, a little bit of my background is I grew up in a middle class, predominantly white community, and went through schooling in that kind of context. So working in an urban district over the last few years has really shaped how I see the issues of quality education in the United States, especially in Massachusetts. Especially if you think of a state like Massachusetts, where you assume there's a little more equity than other states in the United States and other places around the globe. But when you're working in an urban school district, like I'm working in Revere currently, I worked in Springfield, Massachusetts formerly, for those of you who are familiar, another urban center. if you think about the quality of education in those places, it's really disturbing a lot of times. It is really like profoundly disturbing being an educator in those spaces. Seeing students who like a few years ago I had to buy students groceries because students were hungry. They were coming to me, they were hungry. Seeing students being sent to in-school suspension indefinitely for minor violations, right? This is schools with predominantly Black and brown students, right? Students sent to in-school suspension for dress code violations for a week. And there's no question about it. Students who were afraid to walk to and back from school, right? These are all things that never crossed my mind as growing up in a suburban white middle-class district, school district, right? So thinking about how that affects education, right? And as Warren mentioned, right, schooling in capitalist America, right, reference, right? Thinking about how this larger economic system translates into educational disparities, not even just within the school, but also without the outside of the school, and how the relationship between the two. Seeing it, reading about it was one thing. Being in those spaces is another. That it really is a profoundly disturbing, at least at the beginning, and trying to figure out how to work through it. I hope that answered your question. I kind of went off on a little there.
No, that was great. That really answered it. Absa, you can go ahead.
Hi. Sorry, I was trying to get my mic on. Hi, my name is Absa. So I have a couple of questions. I wanted to ask what is the relationship between quality and relevant education? How and who determines it? And I'm asking this question in relation to content that's taught in schools and how schools help shape perspectives of people who go through them. The other question is, I know Professor As gave us a lot of statistics on the number of people who are out of school or have not enjoyed their right to school. In terms of access to education and how it relates to social justice. So I'm asking what you think is our role in addition to having conversations like this in attaining access for people who are out of school or people who have not enjoyed their right to access education. Um, and how do we attain sustainable, equitable, quality education? Um, I also see that the panel is like all white males. How is that? How does that affect the dynamic of the conversations like this? And is it relevant to have a more diverse panel? And why? The other thing I wanted to ask is, should we as I'm talking globally because I'm asking this because I come from what we'll count as sub-Saharan Africa, and I grew up in a society where I had playmates and friends who did not enjoy their rights to education. So education, in a sense, going to school, in a sense, becomes a privilege for me rather than a right. And so should we, as the world, be more open to other forms of education that's not rooted in formal schooling systems? Um, yeah, those are the few questions I have. Thank you.
Uh, uh, Kelsey, I have to go in a second. So could I say something just before I leave? Would that help?
Oh, sure, of course.
Okay, so two things about diversity, which contrast very sharply with each other. One is I just stopped being president of an international organization for 2 years, the International Congress for School Effectiveness and Improvement. It's a congress every year before COVID of 1,000 people in a different country committed to school effectiveness and improvement, talking about things like accelerated schools, actually, Ash, and also about social justice and equity and so on. And Before I became president, I decided to interview 10% of the members. And it took a long time. They're all over the world. It took me a whole summer on and off, but I learned a lot. And I learned that mainly people liked the organization, but they felt that it was old, white, and a bit self-serving. Not male, actually. It was as much female as male. Men don't have a monopoly on bad leadership, I should say. It's everybody has a right to be a bad leader as well as a good one. So two of the things that came up required different kinds of solutions. The first one was keynote speaker platforms. So things like this. And how do you deal with that? Well, we dealt with it in lots of ways. But one thing we did was we had a problem on the 9 o'clock session, usually after the conference dinner, because everybody had been out having a good time and didn't show up at 9 o'clock the next morning. So we invented a thing based on a rock music program I know of that comes out of the UK, which usually shows about 4 acts revolving around. One of them you know really well, that's why you tune in. And the other 3 are different genres, different people, and probably 2 of them you've never heard of. So people tune in to hear the people they want to know. And once they've tuned in, they get to hear the people they need to know. So we created a spot called the Late Night After Dinner Speakers session, where we had 7 speakers, 8 minutes each, on topics that deliberately had no relationship to each other, without any notes or PowerPoints. And there'd be a couple of famous names that would draw people in. And then they'd hear all these other people who are often better than the famous names. And what they learned from that, and then people chose their music to walk up to. They got a spotlight. So it was a bit kind of rock and roll as well. All kinds of music, by the way. And what people got from that was that diversity isn't only the right thing to do or a sacrifice, but diversity is actually better. It makes you better, it makes you more stimulating, and can even, festivals aside, can even be fun. So that there are very practical things that we can do, and it's not always just looking on the list and thinking, how do you balance the group that's there? It's actually changing the format to be more inclusive and dynamic. The second thing that I want to raise, which I urge schools to do, and we came across it a bit, particularly I think in Warren's session, is about conflicting human rights. Sometimes human rights conflict, and we tend to avoid them and steer away from them because they're too difficult. And I'll give a clear example. When we announced that we would hold our next Congress in Morocco, the first time in Africa, and the second time only in a predominantly Muslim country, and we're feeling a bit smug as a committee, having brought this off, somebody stood up in the audience and said, why are we holding congresses in countries where homosexuality is illegal? Because if I come to this Congress, I won't feel safe just by virtue of who I am. I could conceivably end up in jail. And this is supposed to be a free, open, and inclusive space. And we did deal with that. We now have an ethics policy published on our website as a result of how we deal with conflicting human rights issues. So we also need to acknowledge that sometimes intersectionality isn't just invented by Kimberly Crenshaw. It isn't just a conversion of negatives, nor is diversity simply a celebration of positives, but actually human rights sometimes conflict, and we need to be very open, honest, clear, and address those things in our schools as well as in places like universities. And I'm sorry, I have to go now. It sounds like I'm kind of dashing off straight after, but I do have another session in a few minutes. But I thank everybody for organizing this. I did this because it was students, and because of your agenda, and but I've been privileged to be with this great panel and learned a lot about accelerated schools, diversity, social justice, and the magnificent work of Sonia Nato. I was delighted to hear on a couple of occasions. So thank you again. It's been a pleasure.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, Dr. Hargreaves. I really appreciate you being a part of this panel.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Can I quickly answer one part of Absa's question about how do you define quality education?
Oh, yeah,
That
go
is
ahead.
key. Who gets to define what quality education, who gets to define knowledge? Knowledge itself is a social production produced by those in power. So the whole issue of student-centered education, what is important for the students? What is important for them to live as educated members within their societies? Paulo Freire talks about developing a certain consciousness of themselves and about their situation rather than being dictated in what's called the banking system of education. The banking system of education talks about how the professionals, the teachers, the educators, they get to determine what the students are going to be learning, and they are going to bank or deposit this information as if they're depositing money into a bank account. That's not education. The term to educate is from two Latin words, educere. E means out of or from, and ducere means to lead or to draw. Education means to lead or to draw students towards learning rather than to deposit learning within them. So we really need to look at the whole social production of knowledge. What is knowledge? Actually, knowledge is plural. There are multiple knowledges rather than what we are dictating that students should be knowing. So I really appreciate your question, Absence. Who gets to define what quality education is? That's a very fundamental question, and I thank you for it.
Yeah. Just a word. I really appreciate the question of diversity too. The four white guys here. Yeah, it wasn't, what to do. But it's so important. I wish that my presentation could have been made by somebody from, for example, the Association for the Development of Education in Africa, which is key thinkers and people in education systems throughout the continent who come together twice a year to develop the issues and look at the different strategies for addressing them on the continent. I wish they could be here. But I wanted to address the question of where the knowledge comes from. Again, for the accelerated education program, something that Professor Hargreaves said, which is very important, is that education, if it's going to be engaging, has to deal with the internal sense that you have from your own identity and experience of meaning and purpose. And that often is done through gaining knowledge that is very relevant to your own particular community and context. And so in the development of the curricula for these programs, it's done locally. It's done with people in the community, including the students. And the only thing that is important across all is the idea of the competency learning to, instead of just learning to read, reading to learn. By the way, these programs are almost universally taught in the language that the kids understand and speak with some fluency that allows these interactions to take place. And that is a radical shift from the way curriculum is typically delivered in developing countries, which is totally top down and very post-colonial. So it's an exciting alternative, and because kids do so well coming through these programs. I mean, in 9 months they do the equivalent of 3 years of regular schooling and then outperform the kids when they get into schools. And that's because they've learned how to learn, because they understand how to use language, how to use problem solving collectively to help them on their way. So I think that question is so fundamental Who gets to define what it is we learn? My view is that ultimately it's the learner that should set the objectives, often collectively, because we are social beings.
And if I might add as well, like thinking about like who, like I really like that question about the content of quality of education, right? Like I'm coming at this from a more of a Marxist linguistics approach, right? There's these things we talk about as the culture of power, right? Lisa Delpit talks about that in education. There's Basil Bernstein talks about different linguistic codes that are privileged and knowledges that are privileged in schools, and so definitely like thinking of knowledge as a social construction and what is privileged and what isn't privileged in schools is definitely something that's worthy of considering. And there's definitely that places the educator in a very complicated role, right? The educator is responsible of educating other people's children, right? The educator is responsible for allowing students to access the culture of power, access the codes of power, right, and kind of climb through that. But the educator is also responsible for respecting students' implementing culturally relevant and culturally sustaining pedagogical practices. Right, so this educator is kind of put in this contradiction, which they have to prepare the student to succeed in the dominant culture, because if you don't, right, you're harming your students if they can't participate in this the dominant culture. They'll be punished socioeconomically or in some other ways as well. But you also have to make sure that you're not solely teaching the culture of power, in which in that case you're oppressing students. So it is definitely an important, complex question. I'm glad you asked. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Those were great answers. I want to give people a minute if they have any last minute questions. But other than that, I mean, we've already gone over the time limit, although I'm thrilled about that. It means that people were enjoying themselves. But oh, was that for you, Absa?
If there is no question, I have a follow-up for Dr. Nicholas.
By all means.
Thank you. So what I want to ask, and thank you all for your responses. That was very helpful. My follow-up is, by preparing students to participate to become active participants in a dominant culture, are we not, in a way, I mean, if say those students are not members of a dominant demographic of society, and we know that societies tend to operate on dominant paradigms, so who are the majority, who control the power, and to prepare students to participate in those systems and cultures, in a way, we are actually taking away aspects of their own cultures and their being, because you can't, how do you maintain who you are as a whole and yet be a competent participant in a dominant culture? I guess that's my question.
Mm-hmm. So to frame it a little differently, I guess maybe would be to think about it in terms of there's a linguistic term for it's called code switching or code mixing. So there's different ways of thinking about how we help students access the dominant culture and the dominant power. So in a sense, teaching students the culture of power, teaching students how to access the culture of power and work their way through that is, like you say, it is a colonizing act, right? It is a form of symbolic violence on part of the educational system, right? So there's a contradiction there in that sense, that why as educators will we continue to do that? So I guess the way because of how the system is currently structured, right? We think about how capitalism is structured. We think about how white supremacy is integrated into the fabric of our society. Not teaching students the culture of power, how to access that, can also have really detrimental effects to the student's future. For instance, if I don't teach, like I'm a high school teacher as well as a college professor. If I don't teach my high school students certain basically white academic styles of writing and certain knowledges and linguistic tools, right, they won't be able to succeed on standardized tests that actually have those built into their fabric, like the SAT which is basically a fabricated barrier to keep students out of professional spaces. Right, so if I don't teach students, like the consequence of not teaching students the culture of power can actually limit their abilities down the road. But it's also, like you said, there's a contradiction of the fact by me also teaching the culture of power, I am also colonizing, right? This is a violent act that I'm implementing through the curriculum. So to answer your question, I don't necessarily have an answer to the question, right? As an educator, I'm placed in this contradictory role in which I'm kind of damned if I do, damned if I don't. And I could be harming the student either way. So now it's a matter of figuring out how do you balance teaching explicitly. Like my practice personally is I teach students about the culture of power, teach students that white supremacy exists, teach students that these hierarchies exist, and that they're socially constructed. They're not actually rooted in reality. These are constructions for keeping people in power, other people oppressed. So teaching students about the codes and teaching students how to access the codes for their own personal advantage and social mobility, while also respecting students' home cultures and home languages, home practices, is definitely a balancing act. And implementing culturally relevant pedagogy, it's definitely a balancing act as an educator. And yeah, I hope that answers the question. It's really hard to talk about because it's such a complex notion and a contradiction that we're placed in.
And we also have to push for the notion of cultural pluralism, that there's a larger collective sense of culture, but also cultural pluralism about how we need to support, treasure, and cherish the many cultures within a society as well. That's the balancing act. It's very difficult. How do we give students access without, in some ways, destroying their home cultures? That's the balancing act that I think Nicholas is talking about. But there is a way of doing that if we look more in terms of the whole concept of cultural pluralism, rather than, say, in the United States, which is so undemocratic, the whole notion of this melting pot, which is anti-democratic, anti-diverse. We have to change the whole notion of the melting pot and get to something like the salad bowl, where we each maintain our own distinctive cultures while being a part of a larger society. That's hard, but it's attainable.
Just a single word. That kind of the concept that helps to inform this is this idea of unity and diversity, that we have to honoring your own cultural identity and experience, and having that validated by the teachers, by the system, is one part of it. And as Nicholas said, the code shifting, where you actually speak a different language and you act differently if you have to fit into the oppressive and dominant culture. This happens actually worldwide, where, for example, the colonial languages are used as the national languages that you have to access. And there used to be signs in Ghana over the doors in classrooms, speak English only. That's now been abandoned. And it's recognized that you want to honor and build local identity and local culture, and that's okay because of the larger principle of unity and diversity. So we all live in multiple communities, some of which are oppressive and others which are more liberating. But I agree with Nicholas. It's really tough to be honest and authentic in helping as a teacher or as an educator to work through this.
And if I can, I want to add something. I really appreciate Absa's comment in the chat. Right, I think sometimes folks think of this as a binary, as you're either dismantling the system or you're teaching students to access the codes of power. I don't think it has to be a binary in either or. I think you can be working toward both, right? We can be working toward, as Warren said, working toward creating a culture of cultural pluralism in a country like the United States that's actively and openly hostile to that idea. So working to create that culture of pluralism while also not leaving students behind and not able to participate in the dominant culture. So I think it doesn't have to be an either or, it can be an and.
Thank you so much. I believe we have just about run out of extra time. I'm going to stop the recording of our very first SDG panel. Stop recording.